So I'll start just by saying a little bit about MediaSmarts for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. We are a nonprofit that's been in operation for more than 20 years at this point, and our mission is to ensure that Canadian children and youth in particular have the critical thinking skills they need to understand and actively engage with all of the media that they consume. Youth has been our focus, and it remains our focus, but in recent years we have found that we need increasing efforts to educate adults as well, both as teachers and parents, but also in the general public, because of course in our networked world, I'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment, young people exist in a broader ecosystem at the same time as adults. And so we really do have a broad mission of public education at this point, though our focus remains on young people. So I'm going to be talking about health misinformation online. And of course, vaccination misinformation is the best known and most prominent of those, but it's part of a broader syndrome, broader phenomenon. So I'll be talking about health in general as well. We'll be looking at two major points. First of all, getting a sense of the disinformation or misinformation landscape, what it is, why it spreads, why we respond to it, and then looking at strategies that can be used to fight it. The strategies that we use as part of our digital and media literacy efforts, and also what's known from research about ways that both public health agencies and medical professionals dealing with individual patients can respond to health misinformation. So to help you understand why this is a problem, it's important to recognize how the media landscape has changed, particularly really in the last 10 years with the introduction of social media. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is what media used to be, where it was created by a small number of people, it was distributed by an even smaller number of people. It took a lot of money to create and distribute media, and then it was disseminated to consumers. And as consumers, there wasn't really much we could do with it. It was a one-way relationship. Today, we are at the center of an endless network. Every one of us is at the center because that network is endless. Certainly there are nodes of this network that are larger. There are people who are more influential, people who have a larger audience, but every one of us is a part of this network. Every one of us can get information from any other part of this network, and we are disseminators of information as well. And that really is the biggest change. It's in some ways the biggest change in media since the printing press, because it has democratized by making so much cheaper the creation and especially the distribution of information. And really everything that is different about digital media comes from that fact, from the fact that it is networked. So here are some of the consequences of that. We've gone from gatekeepers controlling the distribution of media to networks being more powerful. And in fact, we do see that when we look at who's influential online in terms of the size of their audience, more often than not, it's not an individual, it's a network. Media production, media distribution have dropped in cost tremendously, and we as individuals have gone from being consumers to also being broadcasters. We've gone from an era of information scarcity, hands up anyone who remembers when there were only 3 channels on TV, to information overload. We used to get information in discrete packages. You would watch a news broadcast for half an hour. You would read a newspaper. You knew where it was coming from. But now our information comes to us in atomized form. It may start that way, but then it's broken up into little bits and it gets to us in little bits. We used to know, as a result, the provenance of the information that was coming to us, and so we based our trust on that. But now the general rule is pseudonymity online, that we don't necessarily know, not necessarily because people are disguising themselves, but because things come to us through multiple steps. As a result, where we used to trust authority, we now place our trust in authenticity, in whether someone feels trustworthy, and we have gone from a default of trust because, of course, it costs so much in the old model to create media. People had a lot at stake in those days. If there was a newspaper that was repeatedly shown to be spreading false information, they would lose money. Today, we have a default, particularly young people have a default of doubt. When we look at types of medical misinformation in particular, so everything so far is looking at misinformation generally, when we turn to medical misinformation, we find that there are two basic types. Sometimes you'll find both types in the same source. The first one is what we call denialism, and that is to say when they are attacking the dominant consensus on a point. Obviously, anti-vaccination is probably the best known of these. The other type is what we call snake oil, and of course that goes back a long way, and that is not just saying that the consensus is wrong, but promoting an alternative treatment or an alternative regimen that is not supported by science. Each one of them has different techniques associated with it. So in denialism, people who are spreading this misinformation make heavy use of cherry picking, where if they can find one study out of 1,000 that questions the consensus, that's the one that they'll share. Similarly, there are double standards. So again, any doubt about the consensus view is seen as proof that it's not true, whereas any evidence in support of an alternative view is seen as conclusive evidence. In some cases, they make heavy use of compromised experts. Once again, the single scientist who is opposed to the consensus view on vaccines or global warming or what have you is the one who's trotted out again and again. And of course, they make appeal to conspiracy theory, that they say the reason why there is this consensus, the reason why 999 scientists all agree that vaccines are effective is not because of science, but because all of them are in on it. And of course, conspiracy is what we call a hermetic viewpoint. It's self-reinforcing, because once you start to buy into a conspiracy theory, every bit of evidence against it becomes evidence of a cover-up in your eyes. For snake oil techniques, of course, we see cure-alls and miracle cures, and frequently personal testimonials to that. We've already seen that authenticity is worth more than authority in our environment, and so personal testimonials are very valuable. Meaningless words like natural or holistic, quantum, often get thrown around. And what we see a lot of time in selling snake oil is the freemium model. That's something that comes from online gaming, where you get the basic version for free, but you have to pay for the full version or for the full experience. And so in some cases where people are selling something like a particular diet, you may get that for free, but where they make their money is by selling the book or by selling the supplements or even by selling personal coaching, which we've seen in some cases. How does misinformation spread, particularly health information? One of the ways is mainstream news, and unfortunately, there is a lack of knowledge among journalists of how to cover misinformation in a way that does not spread it. It can also spread through search, because search engines frequently do not distinguish between more and less valid information, and the people who are spreading misinformation are often very good at gaming search algorithms. Social media, of course, is a big way of spreading it, because social media is designed to bring us things that are going to be engaging and that they think we're going to be interested in and that reinforce what we already believe. And as a result of that, this misinformation can often spread through community values. And that can be online, but it can also happen in offline communities as well. And so we've heard of cases where people move to an environment, whether it's an online environment like a mothering group, or whether it's an offline environment like a particular school, and if you feel that the dominant view there is opposed to vaccination, it's very hard to resist that. And over time, either you're going to become silent or your own opinion may change. We're very we're social animals, and we're very sensitive to what we think is the majority view. And here's a good example where anti-vaccinators have actually targeted groups for new parents, particularly parents whose first child has just been born, because, of course, you're frantic for information. You feel, none of us, I don't think any of us who are parents felt at the beginning like we knew what we were doing. And so you're looking for advice, and they fill in that gap. And you can see that they outpace pro-vaccine content 4 to 1 online. And we know half of all parents with small children have been exposed to misinformation, and it really does not take a lot of exposure to have an influence. And they do make use of particular search terms so that they identify what new parents or other people are going to be searching for. They may identify what are people undergoing cancer treatment or who recently received a cancer diagnosis, what they're searching for, and flood the web or a particular network with those searches. Why do people share misinformation? Well, one is sincere belief. We know that some people genuinely do believe what they're sharing. It becomes a part of your identity. But money is also an issue as well. There is a lot of money in health misinformation for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it can be because you're selling things, but also it can just be because you get money for the clicks. And so there are people who do not believe a tiny bit in vaccine denialism, who maybe they got their kids vaccinated, but it's good money running a Facebook page that is spreading anti-vaccination information, or good money running a YouTube channel because people are clicking on the ads. Some people also do it, and I'm talking here primarily about state actors, simply to increase polarization. So we know Russia, for instance, has made significant efforts to increase the level of polarization in Western countries. So they have funded, for instance, both, or they've engaged in both pro and anti-vaccination efforts to increase polarization. And the last one is what I call flypaper. And that's simply that by associating something that is already popular to a certain extent with their views, it becomes a way of drawing someone to their site. And so what we've seen over the last few years is that anti-vaccination, which started out as primarily either an apolitical or a slightly left-wing associated view, has more and more been associated with the extreme right. And the reason for that is because people on the far right found that by taking this view, even if they didn't personally believe in it, it would draw people to their site, and it would expose them to the other aspects of their philosophy. And so like flypaper, it draws and people and sticks them to what they're selling. It's important to keep in mind that idea of autonomy, that some people really are true believers and that they see it very much as a philosophical view, a philosophical identity, but you also have a lot of people who are monetizing it, and we have to consider all of those different motivations. Why is it effective? Well, I already talked about what's called data voids, where they take advantage of a gap, whether it's a gap in a search term, whether it's a gap in a particular social network, having a first mover advantage. And I think that's what public health authorities around the world are finding now, is that the anti-vaccination people and people in many other forms of medical misinformation had the field to themselves for a long time, and it's very difficult to catch up. Similarly, people wind up in rabbit holes where they're constantly getting the same information reinforced. They get deeper and deeper into it, and so it may start with, well, I'm just people telling you to delay or have a staggered schedule of vaccinations, and that moves to full anti-vaccination, and that moves into deeper conspiracy theories. And we also do see filter bubbles where, because of the people you associate with online or because of algorithms, you don't get any competing information. One thing that's really powerful is what's called the majority illusion, and that can be a consequence of these, where you feel that far more people believe in something than is actually true because they are the louder voices. That may simply be because people with one view are louder than others, but it can also be a consequence of a partial filter bubble. And of course, medical misinformation can have a strong narrative and emotional appeal, because when you see someone who is claiming that their child died or was injured by a vaccination, that has a strong emotional impact, and there's a narrative there, and we have an instinct to believe narratives when we hear them. We know that anti-vaccination is dominant on almost all platforms, and that in many cases the algorithms that select what we watch or what is recommended to us weight things more heavily towards anti-vaccination and other forms of misinformation because they're seen as being more engaging. And we saw that. This is an organization called Vaccinate Your Family, where they would put up videos, but what was up next was an anti-vaccination video. And according to YouTube themselves, 70% of views come from the up next. So 70% of views on YouTube are not something that somebody chose to watch. They're things that they watched because YouTube recommended them. So that's very powerful. Who's vulnerable? Everybody is vulnerable. Every single person. Education level has little impact, but people who think they know more than average are more vulnerable. So if you feel, the more confident you are in how much you know, the more vulnerable you are. Medical misinformation, as I say, spans the political spectrum, but some values make some people more at risk. And this is showing you why it's so powerful. Because there are some really healthy habits in some ways, some frames of mind that can be healthy that lead to this. So questioning authority. Of course, in media literacy, we recommend questioning authority. But questioning authority can also lead you to believe in misinformation. It leads to belief in conspiracy theories. It leads to belief in things like false flag theories. Avoiding impurities. Of course, as a species, we're omnivores, so it's a natural tendency to want to avoid putting impure things into our bodies. But again, this can lead us to believe in misinformation. It's led to skepticism about things like fluoride, and on the political side, it's been associated, having a strong moral foundation in avoiding impurity, is associated with anti-immigration attitudes. So when we put these two together, we get medical misinformation. People who are skeptical, strongly skeptical about what they want to put in their bodies, people who are keen to question authority, are more vulnerable to medical misinformation. Then we add protecting children. Of course, we all want to protect our children. The extreme views of that, we get the satanic panic of the 1980s. We get, more recently, Pizzagate or QAnon online. When we put that together, we get vaccine skepticism. So you see how powerful this is. We have three really powerful and generally healthy impulses. But when we put them all together, we have an extremely emotionally potent combination. How does it affect us? Well, a relatively small number, thought to be only 2 to 5% of the total population, are active opponents, but a much larger, 20 to 30%, are doubters, are not convinced. And as we'll see, those are the people we have to focus on. This is not a problem that's going away. Platforms have made some positive steps, but these headlines are all from last week. Every single one of those from last week. Medical misinformation is not a problem that the platforms are going to solve anytime soon. So, how do we deal with this? In media and digital literacy education, we have two sets of key concepts. I'm not going to go through them all, but helping young people and adults in general understand them is key. In media literacy, everything proceeds from the idea that media are constructions. We have to help people understand that everything we see through media was made by someone and it was made for a purpose. In digital literacy, everything starts from the idea that digital media are networked. And that helps us understand that we have to scrutinize where something originally came from, how it got to us, who made it, and how the platform itself is influencing how we perceive it. We've developed 4 simple steps. This is part of our Break the Fake campaign, which we're going to be launching in 2 weeks as part of Media Literacy Week. But we've boiled online authentication down into 4 basic steps that we're recommending people do every time they want to share misinformation. And we're really stressing the idea that all of these are things, each one of these is not going to take you more than a minute to do, and frequently will take you 30 seconds or less. So it's helping people understand that there are fact-checking tools out there. There are professional fact-checkers that we can use. Helping people understand how important it is to find the original source before you decide whether or not to trust something. Because again, the information that comes to us is atomized. We may get it from our Uncle Fred, and we're going to believe it because Uncle Fred we've known for a long time and we trust them. Or we may get something from a less trustworthy source and not trust it on that basis. But we need to figure out where it came from originally so that we know whether we can trust it or not. Similarly, if it's not a source that we know, we need to take a few steps to verify that source. And that, too, can be very quick. Most of the time, when something is a source of misinformation, you're going to find that in a Google search or by looking on Wikipedia. If you see some misinformation from, Joseph Mercola, Wikipedia does not hide from you the fact that he's a purveyor of misinformation. And finally, checking other sources, turning the network nature of the Internet to our advantage and either finding sources that we know are reliable and consulting them, or drawing on a wide range of sources to see what the consensus is. And so when it comes to science and health, there are two subpoints. One of those is educating people about expertise and authority. So that comes under verify the source. And here's an example. Here, Dr. Jack Wolfson, and you can see Dr. Jack Wolfson is a cardiologist. So we teach people to think, well, what does a cardiologist know about the flu shot? So helping them to understand that authority or expertise is not a single thing. You're not a doctor in everything. But almost all of the people who are spreading medical misinformation are doing it outside of their field. Similarly, we show people how to find what the consensus view is. Because what we found is that most people don't understand what the consensus means in science, that it's not just what a whole bunch of people have agreed, that consensus represents the mass of research, of discovery, that the mass of evidence. And that actually does have an impact, that highlighting consensus, being told that 90%, and in fact I think it's higher, but being told that 90% of scientists agree that vaccines are safe and agree that all parents should be required to vaccinate their children, had a significant impact on people's concerns about vaccine safety. But we have to educate people about what scientific consensus is and how it's achieved. And I have to say, unfortunately, that K-12 curriculum does not do a great job of teaching how science actually is done. So here are some sources. You all have copies of these. I'm not going to go through them all. Here are a couple of our sources, including our section on authenticating information and the Break the Fake campaign, and also some health information sources that people can be steered to, because of course one of the basic skills, as I mentioned, is identifying a trustworthy source so that you can turn to it. So moving now, and fairly quickly, to what people can do who are either medical professionals or public health authorities. Each of those breaks down into proactive and reactive strategies. So for people who are working with patients, it's important to inoculate against misinformation. There's a lot of evidence that shows if you address these things before they become an issue, people are much more resistant. So, for instance, if you have patients who are expecting a child, talking to them about vaccinations before the child is born, when they're not so stressed and sleepless, is actually effective. It's also really important to counter the majority illusion and to personalize your approach. So we want to talk to patients before something becomes an issue, as I said. Personalizing your approach is really important. Some of you may have seen in the news today a study that found that Canadians are losing their faith in science, but there's a lot of evidence that Canadians still trust their doctors. 9 in 10. It's one of the most trustworthy professions in Canada. And so individual doctors have a tremendous role to play because they are seen as more trustworthy than agencies or authorities. Personalizing also means putting it in a narrative way, where, of course, you have to present the evidence, but you also have to communicate it in a personal, in a narrative way, talk about maybe your own decisions or about your own experiences to counter the tremendous narrative force of anti-vaccination. Countering the majority illusion, again, is really powerful. It's important to realize that when someone comes into your office, they may have a whole online or in-person community that is giving them the sense that it is utterly normal to not vaccinate. And so it's really powerful to counter that, to say things like, just most of the parents I see vaccinate their kids, or, I've never had a patient have a really bad reaction to a vaccine. Helping them understand that this perceived majority is not real is very valuable. Some of the reactive approaches, things you can do when people come into your office with misinformation or concerns influenced by misinformation. You want to take a non-confrontational approach, acknowledge their concerns, and use what we call the myth sandwich approach to counter misinformation. So to begin with, taking a non-confrontational approach. Obviously, it doesn't help anybody. No one's ever convinced by being called stupid. Not that I'm suggesting anyone would do that, but you do have to think about, don't be hostile. Don't say, well, who's telling you this? Ask questions. You can follow up questions with your own opinions, but the more open you are, the more likely you are to have an effect. Acknowledge their concerns. It's really helpful to focus on the points where you agree. We all want to have healthy children. We all want to do what's best to keep your children healthy and safe. Let's start from there. If you do have to counter misinformation, use what's called a myth sandwich. And that means always, when you're addressing misinformation, start with the truth, then address the misinformation, and then close with the truth again. You always want to make sure that the truth gets twice as much airtime, as it were, as misinformation, so that you're not inadvertently reinforcing the misinformation. So similarly, you only want to address points that the patient themselves has raised. Don't introduce them to new misinformation that they maybe didn't already know. But you do want to provide new information to give them perspective. So if there are things that they didn't know, if they didn't know, for instance, well, how are vaccines tested? How is it that vaccines are determined to be safe? Why is there a new flu vaccine every year? Who makes vaccines, and how is that regulated? That may be new information to them, and it can be really valuable in helping them understand all of the steps that go into ensuring that vaccines or other forms of medical treatment are safe. So for public health authorities, one proactive approach is to raise awareness of misinformation techniques, not necessarily misinformation content, but the techniques that are used so people can recognize them. Focus on the risks of not immunizing, and find trusted spokespeople in affected communities. So the more we know about misinformation techniques, the more we can recognize them. So for instance, we know that when people are made aware that misinformation often is done for a profit motive, or that it's done by state actors to increase polarization, this makes them more skeptical and more resistant to misinformation. Focusing on the risk of not immunizing. So we're at the fortunate point where most of us have no memory of a time before effective vaccines for childhood diseases like measles. We really, of course, want to avoid having that time brought back. But we do need to make sure people are aware that these things, they're not just inconveniences, they are things that have significant health risks. In reactive terms, we want to respond to misinformation and false balance. And false balance is particularly important. And when I say false balance, what I mean is news coverage in particular, whether it's news or opinion, that includes misinformation at the same level as accurate information. We need to respond to that. We need to push back against false balance, because it has been shown to be one of the most powerful things in spreading misinformation. Being exposed to false balance has been shown to have an impact on vaccination hesitancy. And so when you see an article, when you see an editorial, especially in something mass media like a newspaper or a newscast, even in the networked age, these things do have a powerful influence. And so it's important to push back. And we do want to respond to deeper concerns and not specific points. So again, understanding why people are motivated by misinformation, understanding the emotional appeal of it is really essential to countering it successfully. And I want to close with what I call the media effect paradox, because when you're working in misinformation, it can be tremendously frustrating because it's almost impossible to change a single person's mind. And if you've ever had an argument with someone online, you probably know this. Some of you may have friends or relatives who have shown you this. But the fact is that people's thought opinions do change, but they change in a roundabout way. And I'll give you an example of attitudes, and it's not a medical example, attitudes towards gay and lesbian people, and particularly gay marriage. This is an area where, as a society, we've changed our view on it 180 degrees in really the last 20 years. Now, you would be hard-pressed to find a single person who is willing to admit that they changed their minds on that, because that's not how decision-making works. We take our cues from people around us. Again, that's why the majority illusion is so powerful. So when we're working in misinformation, it can feel like you're rolling a rock uphill. It can feel like you're banging your head against the wall. But the fact is that if we change the societal view, if we change the perceived majority, people will change their minds, even if they're not aware that they're doing it. Thank you very much.